Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herr Jesu Christ, hast, bereitt, which translates to Lord Jesus Christ, you have prepared. Fairly straightforward chorale, a couple of places in the chorale that leave room for interpretation, but I think most of it is about as straightforward as a chorale can be. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So 2 flats in the key signature. We start on G minor, we end on G major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G minor, despite the fact that we start in the key of B flat. Something to note also is that this chorale has 2 flats in the key signature. Sometimes Bach writes G minor chorales where we also have only 1 flat in the key signature, depending on how many E naturals sort of make their way into the texture. But instead of starting with 1, we start with 6, passing 7th in the bass, and then we have E flat, B flat, E flat, and that same G, which is a 4 chord in the key of B flat. We see a lot of 6 going to 4 in this chorale. Passing tones in the upper voices, we have E, C, E, and A. Sorry, these are both E flats. This would be a 7-6-4 chord. The inversion doesn't matter too much. 7-6-4 being A diminished over E flat. And then we have B flat major, D, D, F, and B flat, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. Some non-chord tones here, a neighbor tone and a passing tone. That leaves us with E flat major 7, E flat, D, G, and B flat, which is a 4-7 chord. And I feel like that's significant because it takes us to a 5 chord, F, C, F, and A, which is F major in root position. Passing tones here in the melody and the tenor before we get F, A, C, and F, which is still a 5 chord. We have a passing tone in the bass as well, delayed passing tone, it's a passing 7th as well, before we get D, B flat, F, and B flat, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. And it briefly turns into root position here when the bass and the tenor sort of swap spots. Or they don't swap spots really, they just swap their pitch content. This takes us to F, C, F, and A, which is our 5 chord. Passing tone here and a chordal 7th here as well, before we have an authentic cadence here in the key of B flat major. It's our tonic B flat, E flat, F, and that same B flat, or sorry, no, a new B flat, but we have a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This D is our chord tone. And then we move to our next phrase, which ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G minor, and I think we modulate straight away G minor, G, D, G, and that same B flat is 6 in the key of B flat, but in the key of G minor it's our tonic. You can analyze this as a direct modulation. You'd call B flat 3 in the key of G minor. I think it ultimately depends on however you want to contextualize it, but for me, this is how I look at it. We then have E flat, C, E flat, G, and A, which is A minor 7 flat 5 over C. It's 2-6-5. Takes us to D, D, F sharp, and A as a subdivided chord progression here, 2-6-5 going to 1, and that takes us not to G minor like we would expect, but to E flat major, E flat, B flat, G, and G as well in the melody. So that's our 6 chord in the key of G minor. And then we have some interesting tones here. We have a neighbor tone in the bass, which is D, and this chromatic passing tone here in the tenor, which is interesting, it's B natural. And if we take everything that's going on here, we have G major over D, which is 5-6-4 of 4, because G is also the dominant of 4. So we're seeing the tonic function as the dominant of 4. And that leads us to C minor, E flat, C, G, and C. Happens to be in first inversion. Kind of an interesting progression next. Maybe, I don't know, for me, I don't want to say it's the hallmark of the chorale. That's kind of a strongly worded statement for a subdivided chord progression. But we do have C here in the bass, E flat here, in the tenor, along with this A right here, which does briefly introduce maybe a 2/6 chord, possibly. I do think this A is more so setting up as a suspension for the next beat, but we do have sort of a thirds-based or an extended thirds-based progression here with 6 going to 4, going to 2. This 5 of 4 being more of an intermediary chord than something that contributes to the overall narrative of the progression. It's just separating 6 and 4, but the root movement is still pretty much in thirds. Before we go to our tonic, interestingly, G, D, A, and B flat, but this A is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and this is our root position tonic. However, I do actually think this is our first inversion tonic because G doesn't coincide with the resolution, but rather B flat coincides with the resolution. So I'm going to call this a 1/6 chord, and something that's worth pointing out is 2/6 going to 1/6. It's not really super important. It is happening over a subdivided beat. It's sort of turning into a suspension, a 9/8 suspension over the tonic, which is something that Bach does a ton of. Yeah, it's not like a 2-to-1 progression happening over the span of 2 beats. 2-to-1 as a progression is relatively rare in Bach, and when it does come up, it typically manifests with a grain of salt, and this is one of those instances, but occasionally we do see them pop up where there really isn't any other rhyme or reason about it. It's just 2 going to 1. I don't think that's this case, though. I think this is more contrapuntally driven. But after our tonic triad, we have C, E flat, G, and A, which is A minor 7 flat 5 in first inversion. A is a chord tone, C is a chord tone, F sharp and E natural are non-chord tones, but this 2/6/5, we know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. He takes us to 5, D, A, F sharp, and A, D major. D is a chord tone, C is just a passing 7th, and then we have G, B flat, D, and G, which is our tonic triad and root position. Okay, looking to our next phrase, we have a half cadence in the key of G minor again, but I do think, based on the way that I hear the middle of this phrase, we have a mid-phrase modulation to the key of B flat. You could analyze this whole phrase in the key of G minor if you wanted to. To me, it sounds like we depart from G minor and go to B flat, if anything, just for like 3 or 4 beats. So we start off the phrase pretty clearly in G minor, F sharp, D, A, and D, which is our 5 chord, first inversion, D major over F sharp. Then we move to G minor, G, D, A, and B flat. Notice how we have another 9/8 suspension over the bass. It's a pretty common thing for Bach to do, but I do think this G minor chord is our 6 in the key of B flat, because it takes us to F major, A, C, G, and C, but this G becomes a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is really 5/6, F major over A, and that takes us to B flat major, B flat, C, F, and D. Again, not a 9/8 suspension, but a 2/1 suspension. They're effectively the same thing, but it's still a tonic triad. And then we have F, B flat, F, and C. This B flat is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. Another sort of complement that Bach uses in compliance, or I guess in conjunction with 1 chords that have a 9/8 suspension, is a resolution, or not really a resolution, but a progression to 5 that has a 4/3 suspension over the bass, which is pretty neat. We also have a little late passing 7th here in the alto before we go to G minor, another one of these deceptive progressions that we've seen in this chorale. G, B flat, D, and B flat, which is our 6th chord in the key of B flat major. It's also our tonic in the key of G minor. We see this melodic minor fragment here in the key of G minor, so I think we are in the process of modulating back, or if you didn't analyze this as a modulation, this is a pretty clear indication that we're in the key of G minor, because we have this phrase, or this fragment here, that consists of tones of G melodic minor. But E is a non-chord tone, F sharp sort of like a chordal 7th, C is a passing tone, A They're both sort of delayed passing tones before we get B flat, D, G, and that same B flat, which is just taking our tonic triad, rotating it, putting it in first inversion. G sort of briefly takes the chord and puts it in root position before we get D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our dominant in the key of G minor. We have another phrase in the key of G minor as well. It ends in a half cadence. The difference between these two, I guess if you're looking at the final cadential chord, is that we end with the fifth of the chord in the melody here, and the third of the chord of the melody here, which I'd say is probably the least common configuration for half cadences. You're more likely to see the root than you are to see the third of the chord in a half cadence, at least in the way that Bach writes. So it's kind of interesting seeing that here, especially juxtaposed with a half cadence with the fifth of the chord in the melody here. But we stay in the key of G minor. I believe we stay in the key of G minor. You could make the argument that with this F natural here, we do move to the key of B flat, but it doesn't quite sound as B flat solid, or with B flat as sort of the object for as long here, so it feels like more so B flat happens in passing. But we resolve our 5 chord, G, D, G, and B flat, tonic triad. That takes us to not D major, which we would be maybe led to believe by the lower two voices, but we have an F natural and a B flat, which would be B flat major over D, which is a 3/6 chord. Kind of interesting to see one go to 3. 3 is relatively uncommon in tonal music, or at least, tonal music of Bach's time. When we do see 3 chords, they're used typically in some sort of sequential fashion. We see them used in all sort of different contexts, but it's relatively uncommon in proportion to the other chords that we see in the chorales. But because there are so many chords in the chorales, typically one will pop up. But after our 3/6 chord, we have a passing tone in the bass. We then have F, C, F, and A. These 2 F naturals are what really sort of push this section into feeling like B flat major, but I don't really think we spend enough time, nor does it really feel like B flat is the sort of resolving body of this particular section to make me feel like we've modulated. So this F here is functioning like 7, F major in root position, F, C, F, and A, with a little passing 7th here in the alto, and this chromatic passing tone going up, which briefly changes the role of the 7 chord to 7 fully diminished. Sorry, let me remove that. I want to erase it. I think it makes sense now. We're going to use a full degree symbol here because it's a completely diminished 7th chord. The outer interval between F sharp and E flat is a diminished 7th. We would expect something like this to resolve to 1, which it does. G, B flat, D, and B flat. Tonic triad, root position, B flat, D, and G. Briefly puts us in first inversion. All these are chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And then we get C, E flat, that same G, and A, which is A minor 7 flat 5 over C. 2/6/5 being used outside of a half cadential context. That's pretty interesting, but typically when we see a 2/6/5 chord, we expect it to go to our dominant, which we do have in this case. It's being subdivided, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our D major chord, our dominant. So again, we're seeing a deceptive progression to lead us into this half cadence, and I would say that this is maybe the hallmark of the chorale for me. E flat, D, G, and G. Now, I think the argument here is that maybe this is a 6 chord. Now that I'm looking at it, it's not as exciting, but I think this D is actually a 7/6 suspension, it's a 7/6 suspension over the bass. This F sharp is a non-chord tone, and by the time it resolves to this C right here, we have a 4/6 chord. But for the majority of our time spent, it is a 6/7 chord that's spelled incomplete. D would be the 7th of the chord, and we would double the 3rd, or I guess it's not really a doubling of the 3rd, it's more so just the fact that the 3rd is being sung in a unison. Sorry about the siren in the background if you can hear that. If not, disregard. but they're singing in a unison, and we're seeing the alto sort of dip and deviate away from that G before unifying with the melody. It's a pretty interesting moment. But all in all, whether this is 4-6 or 6-7, I think it's pretty interesting because 6-7 isn't usually a chord that pops up in these Phrygian half cadences. This is more specifically a Phrygian half cadence. If you are familiar with the term, it just means that the bass movement in a half cadence goes from the 6th of the minor scale to the 5 of the minor scale. So typically speaking, when you have Phrygian half cadences, there's like always a 4-6 chord lurking in the texture, whether it's being plainly just right there, it's the chord, there's really no arguing against it, or if maybe there's a 2-4-3 chord in the texture, or in this case a 6-7 chord, there's usually a 4-6 chord not somewhere not so far behind. So here we have 4-6 going to 5. That's the way that I see it, big picture, just because the voices or the harmonic rhythm kind of slows down a bit here because the bass becomes static and the tenor also holds a longer note value here. But as we're closing out our chorale, we end in the key of G minor as well. No modulations for the rest of the chorale. D major resolves to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic. G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have D, D, G, and A. Another 4-3 suspension over a dominant here, which is our 5 chord. A little late passing 7th here in the tenor before we get E flat, B flat, G, and G. Another 5 to 6 chord progression. We've seen a lot of deceptive progressions in this chorale so far. Passing tones in the inner voices before we get E flat, G, E flat, and C. Another 6 to 4 progression as well. It's something that's sort of become a bit of a hallmark in this chorale, right? 6 to 4 starting things off, 6 to 4 here. We've seen it a couple of times, but this would be 4-6, really not changing too much of the quality of the chord. All that's really being introduced is C, and it's replacing that B flat from the previous chord. But 4-6 turns into a subdivided chord progression with the next and, where we have F sharp, A, E flat, and C, which is a fully diminished 7th chord. F sharp diminished, fully diminished 7th. 4 going to 7 as a subdivided chord progression is amongst, if not the most common chord progression that you'll find in Bach in this subdivided context, meaning that you'll see 2 chords occur over the span of 1 beat. And that's exactly what's happening here, 4 going to 7 over the span of 1 beat. It's a very common subdivided chord progression. But after 7-7, we have G, A, D, and B flat. Notice how we have another 9/8 suspension over the tonic here. And actually this is more like a 1/6 than anything else because the bass changes by the time we get the resolution. It's still sort of like a 9/8 suspension. Maybe I guess 9/6 would be more accurate to describe the interval between the bass and the tenor, but really sort of operating like a 9/8 suspension regardless because it resolves. We would expect G to be the root of the chord. But closing out, we've seen this cadential pattern before. The only difference is that the alto and the tenor have sort of switched roles here at the end of the A section, but we have C, G, E flat, and A, which is A minor 7 flat 5. First inversion. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords in cadential contexts, especially. A and C are both chord tones. F sharp and E are non-chord tones, and then we get a 5 chord D, F sharp, A, and A. D major, root position. D is a chord tone, C is a brief passing 7th before we cadence on G major, and it's typical for Bach to cadence on a major triad. In a minor chorale, he uses that Picardy third more commonly than he cadences on a minor chord in a minor chorale, but we do see him cadence on minor chords fairly frequently. That's pretty much today's analysis. Really the only couple of takeaways we have are this potential 2-to-1 progression here. Don't really know how much weight I'm putting on this as an actual, important analysis to be put along with the other 2-to-1 progressions, but I am going to put it in my notes so I can come back and compare it to the other 2-1 progressions that have occurred in Bach, because it's one of the lesser common configurations we see. We have a bit of a chromatic bass line here between F, F sharp, and G. turns the 7 chord into sort of like a passing, fully diminished 7th chord. That's pretty cool when that happens. Not unprecedented, but it is on the more uncommon side of things. And then this half cadence is pretty interesting as well. I don't know if this is exactly a 4-6 chord or if this is a 6-7 chord. I think there are arguments for both. I think my argument for this being a 4-6 chord is more based on experience and having seen other half cadences, or more specifically Phrygian half cadences in the chorales. But if you look at this as a 6-7 chord because you're analyzing it on the downbeat, that's what you choose to analyze it as, I'd say that's fully accurate as well. The chords are accomplishing the same thing, and it's largely just semantics at that point. But that's today's analysis. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.